Uh, in the following, like around 30 minutes or so, we're gonna learn about Flutter, how or why I started using Flutter. So I'm gonna describe my journey because at this point it's a journey. It's been a couple of years already, and all I can say about it, like if I have to pick two words to describe this journey, is that I have been incredibly productive and I've been incredibly happy. And I hope that during this talk you get to understand why and maybe think about like, hey, maybe should I try this by myself? Or maybe I should convince my company to just give it a try. Uh, and like every good journey, it starts with once upon a time, right? Back in 2016, I joined BMW here in Chicago. They had a technology center, and I became the tech lead for the Android platform. So we were building part of their connected services. And in this case, as an Android tech lead, my function was to make sure that all the teams around the world involved in the Android app for BMW were being successful. Um, However, at that point, like there was no like really good cross-platform or anything. It wasn't even our goal. But there were a few things that as a company we were doing kind of like not in the most like efficient way. First of all, is that as a company, BMW was an iOS first company. What do I mean by that? When I joined in 2016, I had the privilege of actually making the first commit for the Android project. But by that time, the iOS project was already going for almost a year. And they were actually about to release 1 month after I joined. And we couldn't release Android pretty much like 9 months after. So that's why I say that it was an iOS first. They had more resources, they had earlier releases, they had more features. Our client for Android was using Java at that time, and at some point we started the migration to Kotlin, right? I'm not gonna talk about the benefits of Kotlin, but like that was super fun actually. Uh, as parents, we were using Model View model. It was a custom implementation. We're using Dagger 2, Reactive, RX Java, and all the stuff, right? Like all the like whistles and everything that we're making like modern Android apps at that point. But still, we were not quite successful with our patterns. And when it came to testing, we were like actually spending a lot of time testing, but only unit tests. If you think about it, roboelectric tests for your activities, fragments, custom views, they're actually quite tricky. And let's not even talk about Espresso. So our security layer was just pure unit test on the model view models and other components that they didn't have any Android dependencies. And finally, because we were always behind iOS, we didn't have actually access to our backend. We had no access whatsoever or a way to influence the APIs. Whatever they did for iOS, that's what we had to use. So if you're wondering how did it feel working at BMW, my initial expectation was that it would be something like this, right? Like a world full of love where like iOS developers and Android developers and stakeholders, we collaborate together to create an awesome platform for our customers. However, in reality, it felt a little more like this. They had iOS on one side, we had Android on a different side, and there was literally nothing in common, nothing other than like the backend, but we couldn't influence that. And if you ask me how I felt, how if I felt at that point, it felt like this a little bit. I was like, our Android team was the underdog. We didn't have like a strong connection with our customer base. It seemed that for BMW, Android was an afterthought. And that is actually really bad, not for the developers, but for those customers, those BMW drivers or Mini drivers that they have an Android phone, right? It was really a bad experience. So let's recap a little bit. We had no collaboration between teams. We were completely isolated. We had different release schedules. So all the marketing efforts were put towards the iOS product. We didn't have actually internal Android like employees using the application. There was no internal dog food. And that's bad because your first day at BMW, pretty much they give you a personal phone that is going to be an iPhone. And if you want to try your product, you're kind of like on your own. Our APIs, they were like 100% oriented towards iOS. And this has an impact, right? Because when we don't support the same feature set, some of the APIs we might need or we might have different needs, and we were never able to influence or like participate in the design of those APIs. Therefore, they actually had a big payload on the team, actually teams all around the world. We were not confident in our success as a team. We were trying to do our best and we were like breaking our brains and our hearts to be successful, but we didn't have the support from the company. So what happened at that point? We needed a change, and not just a change of like, oh, I'm going to use this framework over the other one. We needed a big change, a cultural change. So what happened? A new opportunity was presented to us. We started hearing rumors about a redesign, something that might challenge like some of the cultural foundations that we had, something that might challenge some of the business processes that we had. So we just jump into that wave and we ask for an exploration. What we asked was to do some research, learn what's out there. Can we do something better as a company? Even if we're not going to have maybe the support from business to dedicate the same resources to iOS and Android, maybe there's something that we can do from the technology side to bring that support and remove the overhead of thinking about iOS and Android and think instead about your mobile product. That's what we wanted to change. And we knew that if we would be doing the same thing that led to failure, we would fail again. So we started like researching all the things that we could. And we set for ourselves actually a very ambitious goal, a goal that was completely removed from technology. And that would actually help us to find the technology solution that we wanted. Our goal was the following. We wanted to be able to regularly release our products across all brands, all platforms, and all regions simultaneously with the same feature capabilities. There's a lot of information in just this one sentence, and I highlighted the special parts for you. By regularly release, we tried to avoid that idea that we would release iOS first and then Android. And we wanted to remove the idea that our releases would be quarterly. If we can release every 2 weeks, even better. If we could release actually every hour, even better, right? And that's something that happens in the web world where we see companies like Amazon, Netflix, Google making updates to their websites pretty much with every commit. But on the mobile world, that's a little bit different. But still, we didn't want to wait. We wanted to release for all brands. For BMW as a group, there are a few actually brands under the BMW group. We have BMW, we have Mini, we have Rolls-Royce, but also there are some collaborations between companies sometimes, like for example, the Toyota Supra has the same body as the BMW C4. Therefore, there's a lot of technology components that we could reuse, and one of those components was actually the mobile apps. When we highlight all platforms, that is very clear. We want to treat iOS, Android, even web and desktop, if we had support for it, as the same, as equals, right? We don't want to have one ahead of the other. When we talk about regions, you can expect that the product in North America might be different than the product in Europe and the product in China or Japan, right? Because of map providers and partnerships. But still, we wanted to have a technology solution that would allow us to kind of like just have those particular dependencies well isolated, right? But for those that are the same, that are core features, be able to have them in the code base. So what could we do better at that time? Well, we knew that while one team, the iOS team or the other iOS product, had access to the APIs, the Android project didn't have access to the APIs. So what we wanted to challenge with this is like, we all have access to the APIs, and we want to make them robust and predictable. So our development process is really streamlined. Also, we wanted to never say no to designers. And this is very important because sometimes when you're working on Android or iOS, they might propose something and you're like, I'm on a time crunch, I'm not gonna be able to do that super cool animation or things like that, right? We wanted to find a technology solution that would allow us to push our pixels to the limit. We wanted to be full stack and really open to collaboration. No more silos, no more iOS versus Android, no more like web versus mobile. We are a team and we're in this together. And the product, we all support it, right? And by being full stack, even though we had areas of expertise, We could collaborate, we could jump and commit in different code bases to support the development of our product. Ultimately, also, what we wanted to do is to better understand the goals of our business unit, right? We realized after talking with our stakeholders that in their mind, they didn't really understand that iOS and Android were different products. In their mind, they were always talking, like especially at very high levels, about the mobile products, but then down the line, down the assembly line, we had to make compromises, and that compromise always affected Android. But in an ideal world, our stakeholders didn't want to compromise. Therefore, from the technology point of view, we didn't compromise either. And finally, we wanted to reduce our time to market. I was talking about quarterly releases. Usually that actually gets delays because there's a lot of things to test. There's a lot of things to include in the release. And when we're talking about quarterly, there's always a problem. There's a delay. But when we're talking about scheduled 2-week cycle releases, if you didn't make it to one release, you can wait just a couple waits for the next one. And finally, we wanted to improve our developer experience. We didn't want to talk anymore about iOS versus Android and feeling like we're fighting. We want to be part of the same team. We want to discuss all our problems together and find a common solution that tries to make almost everyone happy. So those are the things that we knew we could do better. So our mantra at that point was to create a platform that was developer friendly, scalable, and performant, that provided safe experimentation and continuous deployment. So if we combine the ambitious goal from before with this mantra, that gives us a good framework, a good box to keep our research going. We need to find a technology solution that checks all these boxes. So we did a very extensive research. We tried many frameworks like Xamarin, React Native, even just progressive web apps. We even tried like cross-architecture solutions like Uber Rips. And at that point, even though we struggled a little bit, our conclusion was very clear. Flutter was the framework that checked all those boxes. We're talking in this case about 2018, 2 years from now, actually 2 years and a half, beginning of 2018. At that point, Flutter was in the beta version. Actually, I think it was alpha when we started working with Flutter. And there were a lot of things that they were still not supported yet, like Google Maps, for example, something that you might think like, well, that's very needed for a car company, right? But after talking with the Flutter team and like realizing that everything that they do is open source, that they had access to platform channels, we were like, well, even if there are things that they're not available right now, either we can open source them or work with the community to get it done. So you might be wondering, like, why Flutter? What is actually Flutter? Well, Flutter is a UI toolkit, first of all. Like, it's going to allow you to paint pixels on the screen. And it does that very well, right? And because it's all about like painting pixels on the screen, you can run Flutter on mobile, web, desktop, or like anywhere where you have a screen, literally. All you need to do is adapt the engine. That engine is actually pretty cool. It's very efficient. It's based on the rendering engine that is included in Google Chrome, that it's called Skia. They just took all the things that are not like web related, instead like they parse like other things. So let's take a look to how Flutter works a little bit. On the right, we have a very simple app. We see that there's a button, we tap the button, and there's a counter that increments. It's not the most exciting application in the world, but all the code that is needed to power this application is on the left. Actually, this code, well, it's a little bit reduced. If you run Flutter create from your command line, this is what you're gonna get. So let's take a look to it, because in just these few amount lines of code, there's a lot of information, useful information, that is gonna give you an idea of how easy it is to get started with Flutter. So first of all, every single Flutter application has a main method. That's the entry point. And immediately after that, you just want to run your application. And in Flutter, everything is considered a widget, even your application. So what do we mean by that? Well, there's going to be two types of widgets. Those that are considered stateless, that they don't hold any data that change, and those that are considered stateful widgets. And those are widgets that hold a piece of data that can change during the life cycle of the application. So in this case, the home page holds our counter, therefore it's going to be a stateful widget, and it's going to have a state associated. So now let's take a look to our logic. How do we increment this counter? Well, we can see that by following the material design standards, on the bottom right of our simulator, iOS simulator actually running material design, we have a floor in action button, right? And that floor in action button has an onPress callback that is calling a method that we name increment counter. And literally what we do inside that increment counter is to modify our state and increment the value of our counter variable that initially is set to 0. But the more we press that button, the more it's going to be incremented. And our counter variable that is of type integer is actually in this case mutable, right? It's just a variable because we need to modify its value. And then we're going to have a text widget, right? That through the use of string interpolation with that $sign, we can just render the value of our variable every time it changes. It's as simple as that. That's it. And when we saw this, we were like, wow, this is very, very cool. So if you ask me for a more interesting description or like definition of why we started using Flutter, I don't want to use my words, actually. I want to use the words of a really good friend, Larry McKenzie, who is the tech lead at eBay Motors. And he said this during our Chicago Flutter meetup. Literally, word by word, he said, Flutter was chosen not only because we thought it was going to meet the needs, but because it was a risk mitigation strategy. We were considerably more likely to be successful and deliver the product we were asked to deliver by using Flutter. I didn't say that sentence, and I'm super jealous because that exactly describes my sentiment when I talk about Flutter. Flutter is not like an experimentation for us, right? Like especially at these big companies like eBay Motors, BMW, Groupon, Google, there's a lot of risk. They have a lot of things to lose, and sometimes the benefits are not that high by experimenting. So as part of their research, they realized that this was not experimentation. This was a success path, right? And I share that sentiment. That much that actually our products that are being developed with Flutter, they're really successful, at least from the engineering point of view, right? But also like I have decided to focus my career on just developing with Flutter. So let's go beyond that. What does Flutter have to offer? What makes it special? Well, first of all, fast development. One of the things that is really nice about Flutter is that it offers a functionality called Hot Reload that allows you to modify your code, just save the file and see the changes immediately. So if you're coming from iOS or Android, that means that we're kind of like skipping the compilation step. We don't have to build this anymore. Actually, if you're coming from the Android world, this is kind of like what Instant Run promised, but like actually it works. I've worked with really big code bases, right? Like we're talking about like a couple hundred modules, like probably millions of lines, and I've never seen anything that made Hot Reload slower. What else? Well, it's very, very easy to write expressive and beautiful UIs, right? We saw that just with a little bit of code on our widget example, you can build like a counter application. Getting to this level of animations and transitions and all the stuff isn't that hard. And actually the documentation about Flutter is incredibly powerful, incredibly complete and detailed. And finally, Flutter offers native performance. When we talk about native, we have to understand that on Android, we have Java, right? Or like at least the JVM. On iOS, like we run Swift or Objective-C, and like we have the Xcode like build steps, right? But Dart, the language that powers Flutter, you can compile it to native binaries, right? Like if you think about like C binaries, like that you build with Make and things like that, you're gonna get the same with Dart. So that allows you to get like 60 frames per second in such a way that when it comes to animations, it's so smooth that you won't tell the difference between a native application and a Flutter application. We actually did this experiment. We asked during a user study group, we asked a lot of people, hey, we're gonna give you two applications, one that is native, one that is written with Flutter. Which one do you think is the most performant one? Which one do you think it's the real native app? And 60% of the people that participated in that questionnaire said that the Flutter application felt like the native real application. So that just gives you an idea of how the development process goes. So back in 2018, when we tried Flutter, Hot Reload allowed us to go incredibly fast. It shortened our feedback loops, right? Like our feedback times from coding to market. With the expressive UIs and highly composable widgets, we were able to describe our application as a widget tree, and that is very powerful. But on the other hand, that means that we can just sit with a designer and start building our UI, as opposed to in Android or iOS, where you have to go to your XML files or your storyboards, build those twice, then make the connections and all that stuff. In Flutter, that is much more, like it's much easier. With 60 frames per second, like the user experience, your real users cannot tell the difference. And that's great, right? Like you just have to focus on adding value to your project, not worrying about, will be able to tell if this is not native or not, like will the experience like a performance penalty or something like that. And finally, something that is really, really, really important for like teams that are like of a decent scale, that are like just more than a couple developers, is that it comes with incredible tooling out of the box, especially around testing, right? I was mentioning before that for Android, we had to skip using Espresso or Robo Electric, and we were just focusing on the unit. However, for Flutter, there's like unit tests, widget tests, and integration tests included in the framework. And they almost have the same syntax. And especially for widget tests and unit tests, like they run incredibly fast. And this is key. This allowed us to pretty much introduce our product internally when it comes to engineering to not just like a few members of the team, but like to hundreds of engineers all around the world, right? Like that was very, very important. But also when we're talking about like linting, formatting, automation, things like that, right? It's all included within the framework. I literally don't miss anything that I couldn't do when I was doing native. If any, I have more tools available now that I'm using Flutter. And well, like a lot of the requirements, they were not like, oh, run this on web or run this in desktop. You could, right? Flutter works on any UI environment. It's all about painting pixels on the screen. It's so like an artist is like their focus is about like making beautiful things, that I like to say that Flutter is like Picasso, right? Like Picasso was a Spanish painter and he did literally everything. He was like doing paintings, sculptures, photography, lithography. So I like to say that Flutter is like Picasso because you can ask it to paint anything, anywhere, and it will deliver outstanding results, from screens to arrays of LEDs or whatever you think that is painting, right? So what about Dart? Because we said that Dart is the language that powers Flutter, right? And like one of the questions sometimes is like, why don't they use Swift or Kotlin or like any other language? Why don't JavaScript? Well, actually, Dart is a client-optimized language for fast apps on any platform. We're talking about Hot Reload, right? And Hot Reload is great because it gives you fast feedback. So you require a special type of compilation for that feature. But we also said that we can compile Flutter and Dart programs to be native, right? To be like native binaries. And that requires a separate type of compilation steps. And all that you can do it with Dart, and you don't actually even notice how to do that. It's just like run one command and that's it. Also, it's a language that feels natural and familiar. Like if you've done Java, if you've done JavaScript or Kotlin or Swift or Objective-C, Objective-C not that much, but like it feels like you can just start like typing on the keyboard and it's gonna work. It's very natural, right? It has actually a very powerful future API. And now that in the Android world, we're talking about like, oh, core routines and all the stuff, the future API with async and await keywords for that is very, very powerful and simple to understand. We're going to take a look to that in a second. And also like its concurrency model based on isolates, right? Like if you're coming from node development, it's pretty much the same concept. And that makes it very, very simple. So simple that making a network request looks like this. As you can see, there's no code about threads in here. We have a feature that returns a void. We don't care about the type in this case, that we call fetch temperature. We have access to an HTTP client that has a get method. And we're just gonna wait on the result of that get call from the network, right? And once we have the response, we just check the status code, or if there's something that we don't like, we just throw an exception. If you've done Java, you understand this code, but think about this. There's no thread management in here. You don't have to lock resources or like share memory or anything like that. With async await, you get the job done without blocking your UI thread. There's another topic that I think it was very important for us when we jump on the Flutter wagon. It's that the Flutter community is truly amazing. It's vibrant and welcoming. It's collaborative. Uh, like you make friends all around the world. I actually have teammates all around the world as part of my job, right? And that's great. And that gave me a lot of opportunities. The biggest one is that I started my own community. When we started doing Flutter, there was no community here in Chicago. So I decided, like, hey, I love to be in touch with the community. I was participating in conferences and meetups for the Android world, but there's nothing for Flutter. It's time to start one. But also, like, it goes beyond the social aspect, right? Like if you're a new developer trying to join or like do something with Flutter, there's amazing tutorials, documentation, YouTube channels, paid courses. Like, believe me, this is the best time to learn. But also, like, if you like that social aspect, there's amazing conferences like this one that is giving voice to a Flutter talk like mine. But there's dedicated conferences like Flutter Europe, Flutter Conf, or like participating in some others like DroidCons. It also brings with many other benefits that they're a little bit more advanced for those that are like just going beyond the hello world example. To me, the most important thing is like the UI, the user interface, is described as a tree, in this case as a widget tree. That idea of the tree is very powerful because you can compose your tiny screen as a composition of widgets, right? And that represents a tiny tree. But also your entire application as a feature set can be represented as a tree. And then when you try to show and communicate with product owners, stakeholders, that they don't necessarily understand what's going on in the code, with that visual representation, they can actually understand what the application is doing. There's multiple state management solutions, right? We were showing before how to modify the counter with the set state callback, including the framework. But there are tons of open source packages whose entire focus is how to modify that state safely, how to modify actually the widget tree. We're talking about provider, riverpod, Flutter block, Redux. There's a package for Redux on Flutter, Movex, or whatever you can come up with, right? The 3 levels of testing without like third-party dependencies, that's amazing because you clearly realize that testing is not a compromise, it's part of the DNA of Flutter. So in 2020, I actually make a change in my career. I no longer work for BMW, even though that's a big and important part of my transition to Flutter, but I joined Very Good Ventures, and we see it on the t-shirt, we see it on the slide. So what do we do at Very Good Ventures? Well, first of all, we're 100% focused on Flutter. That's it. Our bet in the future is on Flutter. And so far as a business is a pretty good story, right? We were the first ones to try Flutter at a big scale with the Hamilton app for the musical, right? So even though Broadway these days is kind of like a tricky business, thanks to Disney Plus and all the stuff, the application is super active. So if you can go to the Play Store or to the App Store and give it a try, if you haven't tried it yet, that's a good showcase for a Flutter application. But not only that, like we've been doing projects with Google, the New York Times, Betterment, Policy Genius, Good Money, plenty of companies like from all sizes, right? So Flutter is a good framework and it's here to stay. Let me tell you a little bit about how do we use Flutter, right? We like when we're talking about modularization on like Android, iOS, and things like that, that's something that we can actually still apply for Flutter, right? Like good practices that are not tied to a framework, good practices should be able, like you can apply them anywhere, right? And that's what we do with Flutter. We follow a 3-tier architecture where we separate our data acquisition from our domain rules, from our UI and presentation layers, right? So we usually have well-modularized applications in Flutter. We use Flutter block for state management. Felix Angelov, the author of this library. He's actually a teammate of mine. We work together. We used to work together at BMW, and we transitioned together for with very good ventures. And this solution, like this state management solution, has been key to our success. It's been like amazing to be with him in this journey. We also should, actually we don't should, like this is part of our goals. We don't compromise. We obtain 100% test coverage. That's non-negotiable for us. And believe me, we're so happy that we have this kind of like high requirement for us, like high esteem for us, because this is what allows us to be successful and be confident that we can release. And ultimately, we have a really, really high and strong focus on automation, especially when we're like, as a consultant, right? Like you tend to work on many, many projects, multiple projects. So once I write something once, I have the mentality that is like, how can I reduce this in some other projects? How can I set up like a CI/CD that saves me time? And that is always something that we carry over with us in every single project. So after many years of experience like doing software in which I've worked with Ruby on Rails, Angular, iOS, Android, literally I've never been more happy and I've never felt like more like at ease than with Flutter. Uh, Maybe the experience has something to do with it, but it's weird that a technology framework brings you a smile to your face. And it's been already a few years and that smile has not disappeared. It actually keeps getting bigger and bigger. I know that this sounds cheesy, but Flutter has made me a better person. It's such a humbling community, right? That you kind of like challenge your previous ideas and approach things differently. And there's a focus on like mentoring and helping. And once you feel like you've achieved that, you also want to share your experience. And I don't know, it's just like, it's a really, really good community. But at the same time, because of its level of testing, right? Like the way the framework is done, its simplicity, but also how powerful it is, has made me a better developer. I see development differently since I tried Flutter, and I apply those principles to every single project. So with that said, it has been a pleasure. If you want to get in touch professionally, you can shoot me an email to Jorge at Very Good Adventures, or like I'm also a Google developer expert for Flutter. Surprise! Uh, I actually also have like a lesson, like a course on caster.io called Testing Fundamentals of Flutter. It's a collection of 27 lessons that will take you from like you've never written a test to how to actually apply automation in GitHub Actions and code magic for all kinds of tests, right? I also organized the Chicago Flutter meetup, and you can find me in Twitter for J Coca Ramos. That's it. This is the end. Happy coding, everyone. It's been a pleasure to share this time with you.
Thank you, Jorge. If you have questions for Jorge, please put them in Q&A or in chat. That was exciting. I actually took you up on your word and downloaded Hamilton app, and it looks wonderful.
Nice. Even if you don't like the app, let me tell you, the musical is amazing. I'm obsessed with it.
Yes, Disney Plus made it available on demand. Yep. So the first thing we did once we heard about it, we watched the musical. The app is beautiful. Any questions for Jorge? That was a fascinating journey that you described across different platforms, so to speak.
I could be talking about this for hours, literally.
What was your favorite project that you worked on Flutter?
Well, the first one, like at BMW, was amazing just because we couldn't start small. Like we had like a lot of developers, like a lot, like I'm talking about like our teams in Chicago, right? Teams in Germany, teams in China, teams in Portugal. And pretty much we had like a short time to build like a tiny core and then like help all these other developers to bring their features to Flutter. So the challenge was, how do we learn Flutter effectively? And how do we share that knowledge with the rest of the teams that they've never seen Flutter, right? So that one was really special and unique, right? Because of the scale and magnitude. And I don't know, it was a fun experience, but also like right now, for example, like if you see the Hamilton project that has been like ongoing for a couple of years, it's fun to go to that code base and realize how much Flutter has evolved, but like how well the APIs were designed in such a way that we can just maintain that code base, even though like when we didn't know Flutter, and that works still beautiful and amazingly. So, and that is for example, in my case, that I'm a big fan of Hamilton. It's a fun project to do, right? Like I get to see videos from like the community singing and doing karaoke quite often, but like literally like, there's some other projects like I think also like helping. um, I think that every time we work with a team that is introducing Flutter for the first time, they're always a little bit skeptical at the beginning because they're like, oh yeah, another cross-platform solution. Like a lot of the times, like these solutions come from like the C levels, like CTOs or like engineering managers, right? But it's fun to see that transition from being skeptical to be like, wow, this is amazing. We're so glad that we tried Flutter, right? So it's hard to pick my favorite.
Yeah, the app looks really native. It looks great. Could you share the link to the slides?
I actually don't have them in a speaker deck, so I'll publish them and share the link with you.
Okay. And what was your favorite learning resource to learn Flutter?
That's a really good question. When I started learning Flutter, pretty much there was only the website, and that was it. There's a Flutter community Medium kind of like collection of resources that is very active. Actually, I have a few articles over there that, again, like it's been a few years, they might not apply anymore, but right now, like for example, on caster.io, like I have my course on testing, but another one of my teammates made like 4 hours of Flutter videos that they're available for free. So if you like videos, that's a good resource. There's also plenty of YouTube videos from like Andrea Rizzotto. I think he's a GDE as well. They're really good. If you like books, Flutter in Action is a really good book. Or again, like if you like projects, like looking or reading at someone else's code, Brian Egan, another Flutter developer, has this architecture samples repository where like he creates the same application, but with different state management solutions. So that is actually like a very good way to compare different solutions.
Yeah, and we have questions in Q&A. Can you show the slide with your contact info again? And what do you use for API development in Flutter?
Absolutely. So let me share the screen again. So that's my contact. You can find me on LinkedIn as well or anything like that. For API development, so Flutter is a UI framework, right? So when we're talking about API development, like we're talking about the backend, it depends. Like most of the times when I work with a customer, they have a backend written in Go or like .NET or whatever. The reality is doesn't matter. What you're gonna be exchanging is either like, if it's a REST API, it's gonna be JSON objects, and you can serialize and deserialize JSON objects. If it's GraphQL, there's a GraphQL library. Or if it is like Firebase, like Cloud Firestore or whatever, there's libraries for that as well. Or if you're working with gRPC and protocol buffers, there's a library for that. So whatever like data exchange is happening, you're covered. There's always a library for
that. And there is a question from Tom Daggett. Are there any books on Flutter that you would recommend? So I guess you answered that already. Flutter in Action, right?
Flutter in Action. Yeah, I personally love the Manning books, especially the In Action series. And like the author, he's really good. That's the book that I recommend. I actually started writing a book on Dart. It was supposed to be Dart 2 in Action, but that project got canceled. But yeah, if you're looking for that one, like it's a good book. I know recently there has been another book released called Flutter Complete Reference. That I've heard really good feedback about it, but like I haven't had a chance to take a look to it.
Flutter Complete Reference, right? You said.
I believe that's the name, yeah, but I'm sure if you Google that and you say book,
yeah,
it will show up one way or another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I put those two names in chat. If you see that they're incorrect, just let me know. And then there is a question from Scott Ackerman. My company has some pretty strict security scan requirements for apps. Know of any static analysis tools that
Yeah.
support scanning Flutter apps from a security perspective?
Yes, that's a great question. So that was one of the requirements that we had at BMW as well, uh, because like part of the feature set was connecting your application to your vehicle, right? Either via Bluetooth or Wi-Fi or whatever. So that needed to be very secure. And the thing is like for, again, Flutter is about painting pixels on the screen. If you need to do something that communicates with a native component like Bluetooth, NFC, GPS, and things like that, what you're gonna do is to work on platform channels, right? So that means that you're gonna write, think of, if you are familiar with Kotlin multi-platform, the concept is similar. You're going to have a tiny component on native and then an abstract API written in Dart. And there's going to be a communication that exchanges that information. It's going to parse and deparse. So the security requirements and all the stuff that you might have, or even like on the network side, if you need to do like strict SSL pinning to avoid man in the middle and all the stuff, again, you are covered with Flutter. Like I honestly don't think that there's anything that you cannot do with Flutter that you would be able to do natively. When it comes to like a static analysis and linting and all the stuff, Flutter has a tool called Dart Analyzer. So that's kind of like your Java lint or whatever, very, very powerful. You could integrate with SonarQube or like with other like CI/CD solutions like GitHub Actions or like Circle CI or whatever. You're covered as well. Like literally, when it comes to linting and formatting, like it's as powerful as any other tools, if not more.
Thank you. One more question from Tom Daggett. What have been your biggest struggles with Flutter?
That's a good question. So my biggest struggle actually has been like truly understanding the potential of the widget tree and trying to not to apply what I consider like, oh, this is the way I did things in Android into Flutter. Let me tell you why. In Android, we have activities, fragments, views, even your application file, right? And then you have XML for your views and all that stuff. In iOS, we have the app delegate that it would be like the application file for Android. And then we have view controllers that are kind of like your fragments and activities and views, right? And then the storyboards for the UI. So, and then like, for example, in Android, it's very common to use Dagger or Coin or something like that for dependency injection. However, like there's something important to understand here. And it's the fact that these tools, especially when it comes to dependency injection, what they're trying to do is a dependency graph, right? And a dependency graph is a tree. Like at the end of the day, it's a tree. It's a data structure that looks like a tree. And we have already a tree, a widget tree in Flutter. Therefore, and this is like my thinking, I think that native frameworks would kill to have the tree structure that we have. So when we started doing Flutter, we were thinking like, oh, how can we inject this? And how can we use inject annotations and all the stuff? And what we realized is that we have a tree already. We don't have to put anything, right? And that's when we started like using provider and Flutter block. And we realized that the widget tree is very special. We can modify it as we want. We can scope our dependencies within the tree without having to introduce any other tools or anything like that, right? Actually, talking about the widget tree, there's an upcoming conference on November 13th for Geekly that asked, it's called like cross-platform conference. And I'll be talking precisely about that. Sorry if I'm doing publicity for another conference, but I think it's important to say that it's going to be a little bit like deeper into like how to modify and use the widget tree. But I think that that's a very good segue into this question. So that was what I struggled the most, is like thinking about the patterns that I learned before and realizing that like, oh, all that I learned when it comes to like injecting and things like that in RX, like with Flutter, I don't need that anymore.
Thank you. One more question. Is Very Good Ventures hiring for engineering?
We're always looking for good candidates. So feel free to go to the website. There's a form at the bottom. And if you're going to apply or send us a message, I want you to think about this. Whatever you write, whatever you send us, try to put yourself in my shoes and write something that captures our attention. I've shared a lot of information about Very Good Ventures, about how we use Flutter and our values. So there's a few hints in there to make you understand what we're looking for. But yeah, like in the website, like if you're interested, go for it, and we're always open to start the conversation with good candidates.